So first of all, I want to thank you so much, Laurie, for joining us on tonight's show. But first, I want to check in with your family. How's everything going there in Tacoma? And most importantly, have everyone been vaccinated?
Yeah. Our 20, almost 21-year-old son has been living with us. He's going to college from here at home. And so all three of us got vaccinated together both times. And today he's going to school from home. I'm working from home, and my wife is working also from home. So she's in the dining room table. I had to go down to the basement this morning to do some of my work because our son was taking his theater class from the usual space that I'm in. So it can be a little bit difficult with all three of us trying to get things done in a relatively small house, but we're doing great. It's been wonderful to be able to spend this much time with our son. So thank you for asking, and I hope you're vaccinated and doing well too.
Yes. So the legislature was the most diverse it's ever been. Obviously, you welcome new members of color, women, and LGBT people. And so, how did the legislature achieve this success? Is it sustainable? And what can be done to encourage its continued diversity among the lawmakers?
Diversity, having a diverse group of members is important in and of itself because it inspires other people to want to run. Obviously, like when I ran and was the first out lesbian elected to the legislature, the number of people who emailed me, I wasn't expecting this, but the number of people who emailed me in the queer community about it inspiring them to run was really heartening. Same thing when I was elected speaker as the first woman and the first, lesbian speaker. That's important because it inspires other people. But the other thing that it did for us, lots of people have been lauding this last session as the most productive session in more than a generation of Washingtonians, just incredibly productive. And that's because we had diverse representation in our caucus. It meant that we were bringing many more diverse voices to the table. And one of the things I always find interesting is that can make it harder to get to a resolution on how we're going to handle something because there's more diversity, but the solution is always better. It always represents more people and the experiences of more people. So it's worth it to have to do that work at the table where there's very divergent opinions because our solution is better. So I'm excited. We have the most diverse leadership team that we've ever had, the most diverse caucus, and the best session that we've had in, more than a generation.
For too long, transgender individuals such as myself have had a hard time getting access to gender affirming treatments. Obviously, often their insurance denies them coverage for these services. So, how will the passage of Senate Bill 5313 change that?
That was probably our one of our biggest victories for the LGBTQ community this year, and especially our trans community. We've done work over the past kind of 4 or 5 years with the insurance commissioner, issuing rulings talking about discriminatory treatment by insurance companies and telling insurance companies that they need to be non-discriminatory. But what we continue to see, either because of a lack of understanding or also probably because of wanting to just save money, so much of the treatment that our trans brothers and sisters need is denied in the insurance side of the house. And so what's great is that this bill applies not just to people who have private insurance through their employer or who buy it on the exchange, but folks who are Medicaid recipients. Some of our poorest transgender people in Washington state, our Medicaid program will also cover gender affirming care. Really what people have to do is make sure that they're seeing a healthcare provider who will say, this is a medically necessary treatment for this person. And if that's what their provider says, then their insurer is supposed to provide it to them. So I think now what we'll be watching is to make sure that insurers do provide it, that they don't slow roll it. and things like that. So members will be paying special attention to that. And that's where we really do a lot of constituent work, because that's not really about writing a new law if people are getting slow rolled or things like that. That's about members contacting the insurance commissioner's office. It's about members contacting insurers and saying, hey, this isn't okay. You're not following the law. I shouldn't project. Hopefully it'll all be fine and no one will have any trouble. I hope it's one of the big final steps in terms of transformation of for healthcare for our trans community.
Now, it's been a year since the death of George Floyd and the thousands who rose up and called for police accountability. I myself was subjected to pepper spray, flashbangs, blast balls at the hands of Seattle police. How did the legislature address these concerns?
We had a great team in the House, and the Senate also had some great bills, but we passed I think almost a dozen bills on police accountability. And what we were really guided by when we were doing that is trying to both support members of law enforcement who are good actors and trying to do the right thing. What we've seen over time is that the relationship between our law enforcement community and the broader community has broken down, and there is a real lack of trust, and that's in part due to a lack of transparency and a lack of accountability. So we really wanted to make sure that we were starting to rebuild the relationship between our law enforcement community and our larger community. So what you see are, and I won't remember all 12 of the bills, but you see bills that really limit and contain the tactics that law enforcement officers can use in terms of chokeholds and use of tear gas and all sorts of other more militaristic kind of tools that law enforcement has had access to, that they either won't have access to anymore, or they will be severely limited. And one of the things we also wanted to make sure that we did to not prohibit the use of some tools, and that what would happen in the end was firearms would be used more frequently, right? So you don't want to have these unintended consequences. And our team was very lucky in the House because we worked a lot with the families of individuals who'd been killed in police custody. And we really followed the lead of those families. And then we had an incredible team led primarily by Jesse Johnson from the 30th District, who really did an incredible job of working with everybody to kind of try and find the right paths forward. But, Deborah Entenman also had a tremendous bill to do independent investigations of people when we have someone like, for me in Tacoma, like Manny Ellis, who's killed in police custody. And now the investigation of that will be actually independent of the law enforcement, body that where the person was killed. So that was a second bill. We have a bill from Jamie Peterson, the 43rd, which is essentially about how you de-license, basically, decertify a police officer. I spent a bunch of my career licensing healthcare providers, and by gosh, if we can take away a healthcare provider's license, we ought to be able to also take away the license of a police officer if they're not behaving appropriately. And then we had a number of bills on auditing. Moncadingra had a really good bill that is a duty to intervene when a law enforcement officer sees something that's contrary to policy or law. They're required to intervene. So I'm proud of the work we did, Renee, this year in this area. This is the first year we've really done much of this at all. We did do Initiative 940. We're by no means done at all. This is the beginning of a transformation, I think, and I hope. And I think we've really waded in a very big way. But I wouldn't want to say that this is a one and done year at all. It's just a start.
So Washington has the third highest number of reported hate crimes in the nation. Yet HB 1071, which would have tweaked Washington state's hate crime statutes to give hate crimes a designation of crimes against persons, didn't pass this year. What is the benefit of making this change, and will you push for it during the next legislative session?
Part of the feedback that we got on this bill was that maybe, I think we're, at least in my caucus, there's a real sensitivity to the creation of criminal statutes and who those criminal statutes have been applied against. And so I think one of the things that happened with the hate crimes bill this year is people wanted some more time to think about that and think about there. I mean, there's no question that folks want to do better enforcement and better prevention around hate crimes, but we also don't want to have unintended consequences like we've seen in the criminal justice system, where there's huge disproportionality in terms of who's arrested and who's charged with crimes. And I should just note that they're not all unintentional consequences. Some of them are very intentional in terms of the way that the law is set up. So I think Rep. Valdez, he was the prime sponsor of the bill. I think he's going to be working on the bill over the interim and working with community and folks directly impacted to make sure that there's confidence that that the bill is getting at the right perpetrators and is not going to be used to create disproportionate impact, as so many of our criminal laws have been. So I think that's the rub. There's really no question, Renee, about whether or not we should prohibit hate crimes and do a lot more work around that. Is when we see this, we've seen this particularly in the Asian community, the Asian American community, the number of hate crimes, really, I think, driven a lot by our former president. And the language that's been used by leadership in the other Washington has been very, very harmful. We want to make sure that we can do even more about that if we can.
Now, as you know, we're facing a housing crisis, not only because of COVID-19, but gentrification and rising housing costs. What is being done to provide relief to those individuals who are facing this crisis?
Yeah, so we invested $1 billion. $1 billion really related to the eviction moratorium, right? So there are a lot of people who've been without work for a long time who have not been paying their rent because they have no money to do that. And once the eviction moratorium is no longer, all of those folks are at risk, would be at risk of being evicted. Right. So we've invested $1 billion in terms of funds to provide renters and their landlords. I mean, one of the other challenges we have is we have a lot of small mom and pop landlords who also have not been getting any income over this time because of the moratorium, and they're on a foreclosure cliff. So some of this money is to prevent is to do foreclosure help, but a lot of it is to pay back rents from renters who haven't been able to pay, so that the renters aren't going to be evicted for failure to pay rent because the money that the state has invested. We also, I was just on a fundraiser this morning for the Pierce County Dialogue and Resolution Center, our dispute resolution center, and we've gotten more funding to our dispute resolution centers statewide because they are very helpful when an eviction starts to happen, to get the landlord and the tenant together, and they're very helpful in helping tenants be able to stay in their rental property, or to negotiate with the landlord about how the tenant leaves and when the tenant leaves. And so they're going to be getting funding to help with that. And then we have we have other kind of homeless prevention dollars, and a lot of what we're doing around homelessness is both providing some funding through our capital budget so that local jurisdictions or housing authorities can, for example, buy hotels that are closed now and transition them into housing units. But what we also know is a lot of people who are moving from homelessness into a housed situation also need some supportive services wrapped around them in order to be successful. So one of the big things that we've really started investing in state government is not just the physical buildings or money for physical buildings, but it's money, operating money for ongoing support so that people have the wraparound services they need to stay stabilized in housing.
I wanted to ask you, like, what were maybe two of your biggest personal successes and maybe one thing that you just wish had passed?
We had 4 priority areas in the House, amongst the House Democrats. One was COVID response. The second was building on economic recovery. The third was racial equity. And the fourth was addressing the existential threat of climate change. So we knew that those were the 4 areas we really wanted to work in. 2 things that we haven't talked about that I'll mention are our public health system has been underfunded for decades. I mean, underfunded in huge, huge ways. And the pandemic showed us how much we need a public health system that actually works and what can happen if you have a local public health system that doesn't have the funding to work. And so we this year invested in an ongoing way $150 million per year in our local health jurisdictions to really build the best working public health system that we can. Public health works in all those realms. So I'm excited about that. And then the second big thing is we got through the session with not a single member of our staff, nor a single member of the legislature, nor a single member of the public getting ill with COVID as a result of legislative work. Now, to the south in Oregon and to our east in Idaho, both of those legislatures had to close down because of outbreaks. We were able to work through and to have everyone be safe. And that is in large part due to our commitment to public health. But, I thought a little bit about the fact that there was a new Speaker of the House elected in New Hampshire, and he had a big outdoor public election and kind of party. And 2 weeks later, he was dead. It wasn't just that we were able to have no one get COVID, but we were perhaps more transparent than we've ever been. Members of the public could sit in their homes and testify on bills, which has never happened before. So our public engagement was different than it's been historically, but I think there's a lot, we could definitely argue that it was more accessible to people than it had ever been. I haven't thought much about bills that we did a lot. We passed a lot this year. I think, the police, not every one of our police accountability bills got through. And I think I really want us to think about that for next year. I also think that our work related to criminal justice reform, we need to work more and strengthen our transformation there. The third thing is, even though I can argue that we were more transparent this session than ever before in history, I can't wait for next session and to be back in person with people and be able to meet with members and members of the public in person. And I expect that we'll be able to do that next session. So those are all things I'm looking forward to.
Thank you so much, Laurie, for your time. I really appreciate it. I know our viewers appreciate it. And we all wish you continued success.
Thank you. Thank you, Renee. And it's always great to see you and be a part of your casts and your interview.